A woman cars in fright, clutching at a motorcycle as gunshots rent the air. Each shot shakes her a little more, making an already small woman seem diminished by fear. Another woman carries all she can, a mattress, the blankets, and some clothes, on her back as one child clings to her shoulders, another swaddled protectively across her chest. Military vehicles share the road with fleeing civilians, ferrying soldiers to a front line where death almost certainly awaits them. These were the scenes in late January 2025, when rebels from the March 23rd movement, colloquially known as M23, launched a daring offensive against two of Congo's eastern provinces, North and South Kivu. They quickly captured Goma and Bukavu, the provincial capitals, bringing nearly 2 million people under their control. This offensive and the eventual fall of Goma catapulted the crisis in the DRC, the red-headed stepchild of international conflict, into the limelight. For a brief moment, the world sat rapt, watching as the conflagration in the Congo burned bright, consuming the lives of her people for fuel and leaving devastation in its wake. You may remember these scenes, but what you probably don't remember from the media coverage is why this was happening. Why M23 launched their offensive, or what caused the DRC to collapse into crisis. And that's a real shame, because what's happening right now in the Congo could affect not just the locals of Goma or even East Africa, but the entire world. January 23rd, 2025. The sound of distant artillery echoed across Lake Kivu as M23 rebels seized Sake, a critical junction town just 19 kilometers west of Goma. With this strategic capture, the noose tightened around North Kivu's provincial capital. The city of 2 million was cut off from the rest of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. For the residents of Goma, the nightmare they dreaded was unfolding with terrifying speed. M23's offensive, which had begun in October 2024, had accelerated into a lightning campaign. Roads were blocked and food supplies were dwindling. The airport, Goma's final link to the outside world, operated under the constant threat of rebel fire. In the sprawling refugee camps that ring the city, panic spread like wildfire. Thousands of displaced people who had sought safety in these makeshift settlements found themselves trapped between advancing rebels and the Rwandan border just a mile away. By January 25th, the battle reached the outskirts of Goma. Congolese forces tried to hold their defensive line, but were overwhelmed, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. The advancement of M23 into the city led to their collapse. Power was cut and water stopped flowing. Communication lines went dark. The UN quickly evacuated, and by January 27th, the rebel fighters had breached the city centre of Goma. What followed were scenes like something from the apocalypse. Muzenzi, one of DRC's largest prisons, was breached. Over 4,000 inmates escaped amid reports of atrocities against female prisoners. Bodies littered the streets. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by the wounded, set up triage tents in their courtyards. The airport was the last government stronghold, a symbol of resistance in a city crumbling bit by bit. But by January 28th, even this final bastion had collapsed. Over 1,200 Congolese soldiers surrendered. With the airport's fall, Goma's fate was sealed. By January 29th, the rebels had consolidated their grip. Thousands of civilians fled toward Rwanda as looting spread through abandoned neighborhoods. Food warehouses were ransacked. The humanitarian crisis deepened by the hour. In the midst of this chaos, M23 declared victory, restoring electricity to parts of the city and installing their own administrators. The largest settlement in eastern Congo was now under rebel control. For the outside world, the fall of Goma was like a jolt to the system, the first time they'd been forced to pay attention to the escalating crisis in the DRC. The city, you see, is the gateway to Congo's east, a commercial and logistical hub that links the country's vast mineral wealth to global markets. It is the city through which valuable minerals like coltan, cobalt, and gold pass into the hands of global supply chains. The fall of Goma was catastrophic to these supply chains, disrupting mineral exports and threatening the livelihoods of millions of people. This alone would have been enough to generate headlines, but Goma is much more than just the hub in a gigantic trade network. It's also the staging ground for international humanitarian efforts through eastern Congo, a lush region covering 895,000 square kilometers. M23's victory hugely impacted the ability to deliver crucial supplies like food, shelter, and medicine to tens of thousands of people. Goma's fall, then, meant more than the loss of territory. It was a death knell for stability in the Great Lakes region. An act of conquest that could impact the production of everything from lithium-ion batteries to cell phones. Important as it was, though, M23's conquest of Goma can't be understood just within the context of this most recent crisis. Rather than a war that blew up out of nowhere, the fighting is an escalation of a decades-old conflict that at its core had pitted Rwanda against the DRC. A conflict that has flown under the world's radar even as it has killed tens of thousands and condemned the entire region to cycles of grave instability. A conflict that can only be understood by untangling the deep-rooted history of this troubled region. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. If we were to sum up Congo's history in one word, that word would have to be exploitation. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is a nation of immense wealth, yet this wealth has also been its greatest curse. How wealthy is Congo? Well, according to Michigan State University, the DRC possesses untapped mineral reserves worth an estimated $24 trillion. To put that staggering number into perspective, it's enough to fund the US federal government budget 4 times over. With this much mineral wealth, you'd expect the DRC to be one of the richest nations in the world, and you'd be in good company. In 2022, Jason Mitchell, a senior editor at Investment Monitor, predicted that cobalt mining would make Kinshasa the wealthiest city in Africa. That this hasn't happened is due to a phenomenon that Richard Orty, professor of economic geography at Lancaster University, christened the resource curse. A counterintuitive phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources often experience less economic growth and worse development outcomes than resource-poor countries. There are 2 main reasons for this. First, an abundance of minerals seems to make countries susceptible to the Dutch disease. And that's a fancy term for when one sector of a country's economy experiences rapid expansion, outpacing just everything else. The government becomes overdependent on the revenue that this industry produces and incentivizes further expansion to the detriment of other sectors. The wealth that this creates peels workers away from other industries, diminishing them even further. Second, and in the case of the DRC most importantly, mineral wealth seems to attract conflict like flies to a dung heap. And the first fly to alight on the Congo many moons ago? Belgium's King Leopold II. Now, if you've heard of Leopold before, it's likely in the context of the Congo and the sheer awfulness of his 19th century reign there. Eager to expand Belgium's colonial holdings, the king claimed the region during the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference that divided up much of Africa, and, with an apparent flair for grim irony, he named it the Congo Free State. But there was nothing free about Leopold's Congo. Instead, he created a hell of violence and exploitation focused only on a single thing: rubber. Now, if you're thinking something along the lines of, colonizing an entire country to get some rubber seems a bit much, just know that, rubber was the oil of its day. Thanks to 2 technological breakthroughs, vulcanization and the invention of the pneumatic tire, demand was absolutely sky high. Congo's rainforests, with their rubber vines ready for immediate tapping, presented Leopold with a golden opportunity. The only question was, how do you extract as much rubber as quickly as possible? To quote the BBC, in the absence of scruples, the answer was depressingly simple. Send armed men to a village, kidnap the women and children, and if their menfolk did not bring back enough rubber, chop off a hand or kill a family member. Although this happened some 140 years ago, the parallels to modern exploitation in the Congo are striking. Just as Leopold's agents forced villagers to collect rubber under threat of violence, today armed groups like M23 control mines where workers extract minerals under similar threats of mutilation. And this is a point that we'll try to hammer home again and again in this video, that while the perpetrators and the weapons may change, the sad constant in the history of the Congo is armed men showing up to strip the land of resources like gun-toting locusts. To show what we mean, let's take a super fast overview of multiple decades of history after Leopold showed up. World War I. The Belgian government survives Germany occupying its home country by extracting copper from Congo. World War II. The Allies strip the nation of its rubber while Congo's Shinkolobwe mine provides the material for the Manhattan Project's atomic bombs. The Cold War. The US gains exclusive rights to Congo's uranium. Another example of foreign powers determining Congo's resource allocation based on their own strategic interests rather than Congolese development. But hey, it's not like Western nations are alone in pillaging the Congo. In 2001, a UN panel of experts accused Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and Uganda of systematically exploiting Congolese resources. More recently, M23 seized control of many lucrative mines in eastern DRC, including the world's largest coltan mine. According to a UN report, Rwanda has benefited from this by hiding the provenance of minerals from rebel-controlled regions and mixing them with its own output. Jean-Pierre Kenda, director of the DRC-based NGO Sentinel Natural Resources, believes that access to minerals and land is more than anything else at the heart of the current conflict. And so it goes throughout Congo's history. Outside actors sweeping in to extract maximum mineral wealth while investing minimal resources in Congo's development. It's a formula that has led to some very dark places. Take the aftermath of decolonization in 1960. With so little money spent on education in the colonial era, the newly independent nation had few educated Congolese who could handle statecraft. This created an untenable situation where Congo was nominally independent, but a lot of functioning power, including high-ranking military positions, was in the hands of the Belgians. Barely a week after colonial rule had officially ended, tensions between native soldiers and Belgian officials reached a tipping point. A mutiny broke out at the Thyersville military base, spreading like wildfire across the country. The Congo crisis claimed 100,000 lives, including that of Patrice Lumumba, DRC's first prime minister. It also ushered in the reign of one of the most kleptocratic autocrats of all time. This was Lumumba's former aide, Joseph Desiré Mobutu. You, though, probably know him as Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator who had set in motion a crisis that would continue for decades. Mobutu's ascension happened at a pivotal time for Congo. National unity was still a foreign concept as people were trying to figure out what it meant to be authentically Congolese. In its place, people gravitated toward their ethnic groups, of which there are more than 250 in the DRC. Here's the thing about ethnic groups. They can sometimes transcend national boundaries, especially if those boundaries were created thousands of kilometers away with zero regard for existing societies. Boundaries such as those drawn during the Berlin Conference, which separated the Tutsi people between Rwanda and eastern DRC, creating a permanent fault line that continues to fuel conflict to this day. Although culturally indistinguishable from the Tutsis in Rwanda, the Banyamulenge have today lived for a long time in what is known as eastern DRC. Other communities, such as the Bembe, Fuliru, and Banyindu, however, have often viewed them as foreigners, denying their claims to Congolese citizenship and land rights. One of the first to successfully exploit these tensions was Mobutu, who allied with the Banyamulenge during the Congo crisis to defeat a vast uprising in the east known as the Simba Rebellion. The Banyamulenge's involvement in the conflict resulted in lasting ethnic resentment in South Kivu, as the Simba insurgents of the region mostly belonged to the Bembe ethnic group. The memory of the fighting became charged and tensions were further exacerbated when the Banyamulenge used the victory to expand their territory in southern Kivu. These ethnic rivalries would have a major impact on the First and Second Congo Wars. Mobutu rewarded the Banyamulenge's loyalty by appointing individuals to high positions in Bukavu, the provincial capital, and encouraging their children to attend missionary schools. The increased opportunities afforded to the Banyamulenge led political scientist René Lemarchand to note, from a primarily rural, isolated, backward community, the Banyamulenge would soon become increasingly aware of themselves as a political force. However, Mobutu's support was purely opportunistic, and he had no problems throwing his allies under the bus when circumstances changed. In 1981, for example, his government adopted a restrictive law effectively denying the Banyamulenge citizenship and political rights. To call this betrayal devastating for the Banyamulenge is a little like saying that Disney's live-action Snow White was mildly controversial. After supporting Mobutu's regime and fighting on his behalf, the Banyamulenge suddenly found themselves stateless in their own home. Their anger at this betrayal culminated in the First Congo War, during which they allied with Laurent Kabila to oust Mobutu. As we'll see in a second, This did not end well for them. Now, before we get on to unpicking that insanely complex narrative, we just want to emphasize again the complex role that ethnicity plays in the Congo's recurrent crises. The arbitrary borders drawn during the Berlin Conference didn't just create an identity crisis for the Banyamulenge, they set the stage for conflict between Rwanda and the DRC. Rwanda's current president, Paul Kagame, has publicly questioned the colonial borders between Congo and Rwanda. In a televised address in 2024, at the height of the current conflict, he said, "The borders that were drawn during colonial times had our countries divided. A big part of Rwanda was left outside in eastern Congo." Kagame's statement fits into a broader historical narrative of a greater Rwanda. The idea that Rwanda should have influence over, if not outright dominion of, territories of the pre-colonial kingdom of Rwanda, even if they fall in other countries. While Kagame's statement did not explicitly mention territorial claims, it was interpreted in Kinshasa as a desire by Rwanda to redraw its borders and annex part of the Congo. This interpretation is not wholly unsurprising, given the history of such territorial claims. A history that stretches all the way back to one of the most consequential, overlooked pair of conflicts in modern history, the First and Second Congo Wars. Now, in our introduction to Mobutu just a moment ago, we called him a kleptocrat. And with good reason. He plundered the DRC, renamed Zaire under his watch, so thoroughly that the military, usually the best paid during a dictatorship to prevent an uprising, had to prey upon civilians for survival. He apparently once asked his soldiers, "Why do you need a salary when you have weapons?" With Mobutu's eyes fixed firmly on his ever-expanding bank account, rebel forces, including those led by future President Laurent Désiré Kabila, were planting roots in eastern DRC. Although the Congolese army tried to quell the rebellions, there was only so much that exhausted and demoralized soldiers who were barely drawing a salary could do. But while Mobutu's lust for gold would help prepare the kindling for the upcoming conflict, it would be a conflagration in neighboring Rwanda that sent the whole region up in flames. That conflagration, of course, that was the Rwandan Genocide. In 1994, a long-standing schism between the nation's Tutsi and Hutu ethnicities erupted into civil war, one in which Tutsis were slaughtered on an eye-watering scale. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million perished in barely 100 days. The only reason the number isn't higher is because of a stunning military operation by the Rwandan Patriotic Front. A Tutsi militia led by future President Paul Kagame, the group took up arms against the government, defeated their forces, and put an end to the genocide. But while that's where most histories of the period end, for those in neighboring DRC, it was only the beginning of the bloodshed. Fearing retaliation now that the Tutsis were in power, more than 1 million Hutus fled Rwanda for the DRC. Suddenly, eastern DRC was hosting history's largest refugee crisis. Among those refugees were the genocidaires, aka the same monsters who'd just carried out the Rwandan genocide. They brought their weapons, military structure, and genocidal ideology with them, embedding themselves in refugee camps. Refugee camps that now sat slap bang in the middle of the region that the Banyamulenge group called home. A group that, as you may recall, are culturally indistinguishable from the Tutsis, the very people the genocidaires had just been trying to kill. International aid therefore flowed into these camps, with a terrible irony. Humanitarian assistance meant for innocent refugees was being diverted by the genocide perpetrators who now controlled the camps. The genocidaires established a state in exile, using the camps as bases to regroup, rearm, and launch cross-border attacks into Rwanda. Attacks punctuated with the killing of Tutsi refugees in DRC, as well as the slaughter of local Banyamulenge. For Rwanda's new Tutsi-led government, this situation presented an existential threat. The increased ethnic tension, Mobutu's weak and ineffective government in Kinshasa, and the security risk posed by the genocidaires placed Kigali at a crossroads. They could either do nothing and risk igniting one of the most devastating conflicts in human history, or they could act and eliminate the risk to their own people. Care to guess how Kigali chose to act? Well, according to Philip Reintjens, Professor Emeritus at the University of Antwerp, Rwanda probably began forming Tutsi militias to fight the DRC as early as 1995. The date is important because a year later, on August 31st, 1996, the Banyamulenge rebellion broke out, marking the beginning of the First Congo War. The consensus among Congo experts is that although there was disquiet in eastern DRC, the rebellion was most likely not a grassroots movement. According to Yoweri Museveni, Uganda's president, and at the time a close ally of Paul Kagame, Rwanda's army had recruited the Banyamulenge, radicalized them, and incited the rebellion. I want to take a moment to point out a pattern here. Rwanda trains a militia and incites a grassroots movement in eastern DRC, and when a rebellion invariably breaks out, Rwanda is right there to escalate it. It is the same pattern that is happening right now with M23. Now, back in 1996, it was all new though. That year, Banyamulenge fighters and non-Tutsi militias coalesced under one banner, the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, or AFDL, led by Laurent Kabila. Congo observers, and Paul Kagame himself, claimed that Kigali played a significant role in forming the AFDL. With support from Rwanda, Eritrea, and Uganda, the AFDL managed to capture a large swath of territory on DRC's eastern edge. Concurrently, Rwanda was destroying the Genocide's base, forcibly repatriating Tutsi refugees, and capturing vital mines. For a while, the territory in eastern DRC was enough to satisfy the rebels, but then Kinshasa made a decision that escalated everything. Realizing the precariousness of their situation, Mobutu's government hired a group of Eastern European mercenaries, primarily members of the 10th Sabotage Detachment of the Bosnian Serb Army. Fighting as the White Legion, the mercenaries were tasked mainly with training Mobutu's troops and defending the strategically important town of Kisangani. The introduction of foreign mercenaries into the war was like pouring gasoline onto an inferno. In Kagame's mind, the mercenaries indicated a willingness on Mobutu's part to wage a real war on Rwanda. So, he decided to wage a war on them first. Kabila's forces launched an offensive against the government in March 1997, and by April controlled about a quarter of the country, an area larger than the entire state of California, by the way. Mobutu's government publicly downplayed the rebels' advance. However, negotiations were happening in private, resulting in the appointment of Etienne Tshisekedi, the father of DRC's current president, Felix Tshisekedi, as prime minister. Kabila, gaining strength with each victory and reinforced by Angolan forces, dismissed the appointment, warning Tshisekedi that he wouldn't be involved in a new government should he accept the post. The AFDL made their way through the Congolese countryside, facing less resistance with every town they captured as morale in the Congolese army crumbled. Rather than Mobutu's soldiers, the AFDL's most formidable challenge was the dilapidated infrastructure, which sometimes made transport nigh on impossible. In a strange case of irony, Mobutu's galactic-sized corruption may have bought him some time while the AFDL struggled through dirt paths. However, even this wasn't long enough to prepare a solid defense. The AFDL launched a dramatic pincer offensive, with one arm capturing the towns of Kisangani, Boende, and Mbandaka, and the other capturing Bakwanga and Kitwit. The White Legion proved woefully ineffective in protecting Kisangani, their battle against the AFDL lasting only 2 days before they collapsed. At this point, it seemed Mobutu saw the writing on the wall. Fleeing to Morocco, he died on September 7th, 1997, officially ending one of the most traumatic periods in Congo's history. Now, whenever we talk about rebellions fighting against brutal dictators, especially ones as repressive as Mobutu, there's a tendency to portray the rebels as saints fighting the good fight, that the ends justify the means. The AFDL, however, they were no saints. During their campaign to oust Mobutu, they systematically shelled refugee camps, used sexual violence as a weapon of war, and committed massacres. Gaining the reins of power tempered the worst of their excesses, but transitioning from insurgency to governance takes a deft hand. Unfortunately, Kabila's hands were less small and dexterous and more Shrek after huffing bath salts. Kabila faced two immediate challenges that hamstrung his administration. First, the corruption of the Mobutu era had permeated every level of government. To address this, he instituted an aggressive centralization campaign that caused friction with minority communities in the east, including the Banyamulenge. Second, to the average Congolese, Kabila was a puppet of foreign interests and only served at Kigali's pleasure. To counter this image and court public support, Kabila turned against his allies, expelling all foreign fighters from the DRC on July 26, 1998. You can almost picture the expression on Paul Kagame's face when he got the news, the look of someone who had just swallowed a lemon so bitter that he's going to make it his life's work from that moment on to destroy all citrus fruits. And you better believe that Kabila and his nation would be first in line for pulping. It was a mere 7 days after Kabila expelled all foreign fighters from DRC that everything went to hell. On August the 2nd, the Banyamulenge launched a rebellion in Goma with Kigali support. A well-armed and organised militia, the Rally for Congolese Democracy, or RCD, emerged with backing from Uganda and Rwanda, quickly dominating eastern DRC. Sound familiar? Well, according to a report from the Catholic News Agency, one of the first things that the new militia did was train its sights on an old foe, the Hutus. The report details a brutal campaign in the eastern DRC village of Kasika, where they killed 600 Hutus from August 24th to September the 5th. In retaliation, proving that there are no permanent enemies in war, Kabila allied with the Hutus and began a coordinated media campaign to demonize the Tutsis. The BBC reports that Major Mudenke, a Kabila ally, went on the radio urging the Congolese to, quote, take revenge on the Rwandans and massacre them without mercy. Quoting the Major's own words here, people must bring a machete, a spear, an arrow, a hoe, spades, rakes, nails, truncheons, electric irons, barbed wire, stones, and the like, in order, dear listeners, to kill the Rwandan Tutsis. We say no to the expansion of Rwanda into the Democratic Republic of Congo. We say no to Tutsi hegemony. We say no to reviewing borders fixed by the Berlin Conference in 1885. And this message was clear. The Tutsis were the Rwandan or Congolese Banyamulenge were the enemy, and the state would reward their elimination. The lynchings began almost immediately. The Major's assertion that they wouldn't allow a review of the colonial boundaries is important here because Kigali had claimed a large section of eastern DRC as historically Rwandan. Kigali also asserted that Kinshasa was plotting genocide against the Tutsi, pointing to Mudenke's statements and the government-encouraged violence. This is why it's so important to understand the twisted role ethnicity and ethnic divisions play in eastern Congo. With lines drawn thoughtlessly on a map, the Berlin Conference had set the region on a long road towards the horrors of the late 20th century, a road paved with the exploitation of Congo's resources, both by outside actors and the young nation's own elites. Not that all those involved in this story were mere prisoners of history. They also had their own agency and motivations, agency that drove them to do some supremely dark things. Rwanda had some early success in the war, with the most notable being Operation Katona. The brainchild of James Kabarebe, a Rwandan military officer and Kabila's former chief of staff, Operation Katona was a daring mission where a group of Rwandan commandos took over Goma International Airport, hijacking 4 civilian planes. They flew to Katona Air Base, where they found a motley crew of hungry, ill-equipped soldiers who were easily swayed to Kigali's side. With Katona firmly in their grasp, it was only a matter of time before they captured all the nearby towns. While Kabarebe was capturing Katona, another contingent of rebels focused on the Inga hydroelectric power station. Inga was a crucial piece of infrastructure that provided power not only to Kinshasa, but also to the port city of Matadi, through which most of Kinshasa's food passed. Kabila's government quickly found itself between a gun-toting rock and a hard place. On one hand, a rebel force was rapidly advancing to the capital, and on the other, a starving populace sat in the dark with nothing to distract them from the hunger gnawing at their bellies. So, what's a desperate and cornered warlord turned leader to do? Well, when you can't beat them, you beg for help. Rwanda had the backing of Uganda, which was starting its own militia, the Movement for the Liberation of Congo, or MLC, so Kabila needed friends of his own. During a meeting in Harare, he secured the support of Angola, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. Later, Sudan and Chad joined the war on Kabila's side. Help came in the nick of time. In September, Zimbabwean and Angolan forces helped Kabila to hold off a wave of rebels who had reached the capital's outskirts. Despite these victories, Kabila and co. couldn't defeat the rebels. For a while, it seemed like the situation would escalate to a full-blown regional war, drawing in the Ugandan and Rwandan national armies. That it didn't is mostly due to Nelson Mandela. The South African president and other African statesmen urged the belligerent nations to resolve the conflict peacefully, and on January the 18th, 1999, the foreign nations signed a ceasefire agreement. It covered everything, from the opening of humanitarian corridors to the withdrawal of foreign troops from DRC territory after deployment of a peacekeeping operation. The ceasefire was a good idea in principle. In practice, though, the fighting continued because the RCD refused to sign. By this point, the RCD didn't just want to fight Kabila's government, they fought each other. Tensions had arisen within the group over the dominance of the Banyamulenge and, by extension, Rwanda. In early April, Ernest Wamba Diwamba, the leader of the RCD, moved his base from Goma to Ugandan-controlled Kisangani. He started a breakaway faction, RCD Kisangani, which morphed into the Forces for Renewal. Those who stayed behind took the name RCD Goma, appointing pro-Rwandan figure Dr. Emile Ilunga as their new leader. One of his first acts was leading his forces in fighting Wamba's troops for the control of Kisangani. So you could probably see what we mean about infighting. Now, at this point, you've completely lost track of who's fighting who and what rebel group has what acronym. Don't worry, you're definitely not alone. The key points here isn't for you to follow every twist and turn of this conflict, a feat that would probably involve more maps, appendices, and character genealogies than Lord of the Rings. Rather, it's to demonstrate how internal divisions and the influence of outside actors combined to shatter DRC into a million fragments. Fragments that are still at the heart of the crisis today. To finish our narrative of the war, though, the first player to be taken off the board was Uganda, which signed a peace treaty with Kabila. This spurred the remaining 6 warring states and the various rebel groups they backed to sign something known as the Lusaka ceasefire. But barely had the ink dried before everyone was back at it again, with Uganda and Rwanda, allies through the First Congo War and for much of the Second, even fighting in the streets of Kisangani. In the end, it would take a much bigger change to wind the fighting down, and that was the removal of Laurent Kabila. On January the 16th, 2001, an 18-year-old child soldier, Rashidi Mzele, shot the president 4 times in the stomach. He wouldn't survive. We haven't discussed it before, but child soldiers, known locally as Kadogos from the Swahili word Ndogo meaning small, were a common feature of both the First and Second Congo Wars. All sides actively conscripted child soldiers, and according to experts, it's still happening today. In 2024, the UN revealed the groups all over the world, from the DRC to Colombia, had increased the conscription of child soldiers. Laurent Kabila's assassination paved the way for his son, Joseph Kabila, to take over. It was under his rule that the war would at last come to an end. The younger Kabila proved to be a more adept statesman than his father, bringing security to Western DRC, reducing inflation, and negotiating a resumption of Western aid. Exhausted and demoralized, some RCD fighters laid down their arms, deciding life under the new Kabila's government was preferable to dying in the jungle. This was a significant blow to Rwanda, and it wouldn't be the last one. The Banyamulenge had tired of Kigali's control and the never-ending cycle of violence. Several mutinied, resulting in violent clashes against the Rwandan forces. With the tide turning in Kinshasa's favor, it was becoming clear that the war's end was looming. In April 2002, the belligerents signed the Sun City Agreement, creating a framework for the DRC to have a unified, multi-party government and a return to democratic elections. This was followed by the signing of the Pretoria Accords between Rwanda and the DRC, which led to the eventual withdrawal of Rwandan troops from the Congo. In September of that same year, Uganda and Kinshasa signed the Luanda Agreement, formalizing peace between the two nations. In December, various Congolese parties, including the armed resistance groups, Kabila's government, the civil society, and the domestic political opposition, signed the Global and All-Inclusive Agreement. It outlined a plan for transitional governance and eventual elections after 2 years. At a cost of somewhere in the region of 6 million lives, the war was finally over. With a transitional government in place, the Congolese could get on with the job of rebuilding their shattered country. Except, you already know that didn't happen. While the Second Congo War might have drawn to a close, the old issues of outside meddling, resource exploitation, and ethnic rivalries would keep eating away at the state. This undermined any chance at a lasting peace that may have ever existed, and led the nation toward the crisis that we're seeing today. From everything you've just heard, you'd probably agree that the situation in the Congo is, to put it rather diplomatically, complicated. And now here's the kicker. What we've told you so far, well, that is barely the tip of a Titanic sinking iceberg. We focused on a few key armed groups, M23, AFDL, RCD, and with good reason. There's a nearly unbroken chain from the formation of the AFDL in 1996 to M23 and the current violence that's rocking the country. But they're not the only players. According to observers, there are today more than 120 armed groups in the DRC, with more than 70 operating in the Kivu provinces alone. The Kivus, and eastern DRC in general, are particularly attractive to armed groups for a wide variety of reasons. First, easy access to Uganda and Rwanda for recruiting, getting reinforcements, and treating their wounded. M23's current success hinges on access to these two countries. Second, the minerals and other natural resources like timber provide a ready revenue source for the armed groups. Militias need guns, ammo, training, and food, costs that add up fast, which is why a lot of these groups also moonlight as smugglers. Third, and perhaps most important, there's a feeling among residents of eastern DRC that Kinshasa, nearly 1,600 kilometers away, has abandoned them. That if it wasn't for the minerals, the government would be content to let the armed groups just run wild. This neglect is best seen in the army, which according to DW is poorly equipped with no means to enforce state control over the areas that they're supposed to protect. What's more, it's not unusual for soldiers to wait months for pay, a pattern that started under Mobutu and has continued to this day. Finally, there's the forests, which, aside from being a source of timber, provide the perfect hiding spot from which to launch ambushes and guerrilla strikes. Now that we know why these groups are often based in eastern DRC, let's talk about a few, starting with the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or FDLR. Formed by, among others, the genocidaires who had fled Rwanda, the FDLR is an ethnic Hutu group opposed to Tutsi influence in Congo and Rwanda. Based in the dense forests of the Kivus, FDLR is one of the most uniquely violent groups in the Congo. And in a country where violence is the order of the day, that is saying something, so let us paint a picture for you. According to a 2010 report from Amnesty International, FDLR killed 96 civilians in North Kivu, some of whom were burned alive in their homes. Furthermore, according to Human Rights Watch, in 2012, FDLR attacked villages in Masisi, killing 6 civilians, sexually assaulting 2 women, and abducting at least 48 people. Later that same year, they would attack villages in South Kivu, launching one of the most barbaric attacks in Congo's history. FDLR fighters with machetes and knives hacked to death dozens of civilians, including numerous children. Given this extensive history of violence, you'd expect Kinshasa to be hard at work stamping them out. That they aren't, well, that's a testament to just how complicated the situation in the DRC truly is. As their name suggests, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda have one goal: to liberate Rwanda from Tutsi rule. For Kinshasa, they're the perfect proxies against Rwandan-backed militias, a fact that successive governments have taken advantage of from the Second Congo War until now. They are also a convenient scapegoat, easily thrown under the bus when international pressure to find a peaceful solution to the conflict mounts. For Kigali, meanwhile, the FDLR are both an existential threat and an opportunity. The existential threat, pretty obvious. The opportunity, continued justification for their actions in the DRC. In early March 2025, M23 made a big show of handing over captured FDLR soldiers to the Rwandan government. Among them were senior FDLR leaders, including Brigadier General Jean-Baptiste Gakwere and Major Gilbert Nadambaye. Rwanda touted the capture as proof of their long-standing claims that the genocidaires still posed a threat to the nation. Rwanda's foreign minister went further and said that the FDLR were now a greater threat, that they had support from the Congolese government and were embedded in the Congolese army. Kinshasa, on the other hand, in a statement from the Armed Forces Chiefs of Staff, dismissed the handover as a staged event to discredit the army and justify Rwanda's invasion of the DRC. Now, let's step away from FDLR for a moment and look at another armed group terrorizing Eastern Congo, the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF. If the FDLR represents the lasting toxicity of the Rwandan genocide, the ADF embodies something equally concerning: the expanding reach of global jihadist networks into Africa. Formed in 1996 by Jamil Makulu, a hardline Ugandan Muslim convert radicalized in Saudi Arabia, the ADF initially aimed to overthrow President Museveni and establish an Islamic fundamentalist state. From 1996 to 1998, they carried out a series of escalating attacks culminating in the Kichwamba massacre, where they killed 80 students and kidnapped 100 more. By 2002, a series of military defeats at the hands of the Ugandan army forced the ADF to move to the DRC, where they focused on illegal mining and logging. They would continue to launch small-scale attacks until 2013, when they adopted increasingly brutal tactics, carrying out massacres of civilians in both the DRC and Uganda, using, among other implements, machetes and hatchets. Their attacks often targeted villages, hospitals, and schools, with survivors reporting that the fighters sometimes forced family members to watch as their relatives were killed. The brutality escalated further in 2019, coinciding with a significant development. The ADF had pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, becoming the Islamic State Central Africa Province, or ISCAP. This alliance brought with it a shift in tactics, including more sophisticated propaganda efforts, increased use of improvised explosive devices or IEDs, and attacks on government infrastructure. The increased violence would culminate in October 2021, when Uganda was rocked by a coordinated suicide bombing campaign. One attack happened barely 100 meters from the entrance of Parliament. Kampala, angry at the repeated attacks, got permission from Kinshasa to conduct an Operation Shujaa, against the ADF on Congolese territory. According to the Congo Research Group, Operation Shujaa exacerbated existing tensions between Uganda and Rwanda. Both countries had previously accused the other of destabilization attempts, and Rwandan intelligence feared that Uganda would use its presence in the DRC to undermine Kigali. At the time, this felt like a warranted response to a terrorist attack, but with the benefit of hindsight, we can see the seeds of the current crisis taking root. What makes the ADF different, and to a degree more formidable than other armed groups in the DRC, is the religious underpinnings of its resistance. While other groups have ethnic roots and are thus limited in their base of support, ADF's jihadi nature allows it to recruit more widely, as religion often transcends ethnicity. ADF also enjoys support from other ideologically aligned groups. The Islamic State provided it with financing, while, according to independent journalist Sungata West, Somalia's Al-Shabaab has provided training and support in organizing attacks. Taken collectively, these facts paint a grim picture of the present and portends an even darker future. Left unchecked, the spread of jihadist ideology in Eastern and Central Africa threatens to plunge the region into a Sahel-level crisis. The world just cannot afford this. The final group on our list, the Mai Mai, isn't so much a group as it is a ragtag bunch of community-based militias that have proliferated across Eastern DRC. The name comes from the Swahili word for water, maji, reflecting the fighters' belief that magical water can protect them from bullets. The Mai Mai are best understood in the words of Kapopo, a former commander of the Mai Mai group in South Kivu, quoting, "The Mai Mai, it's not only us, it's everyone. It's every patriot who defends the Congo. It's not a movement linked to a person, it's the state of mind of every patriot, of those who defend their country and do not want aggression and the pillage of natural resources." End quote. The Mai Mai phenomenon represents a fundamental truth about the DRC. When the state fails to provide security, communities will find ways to defend themselves, for better or for worse. Other than a common collective name and a desire to protect their homelands, there's little linking the various Mai Mai groups. Their ad hoc nature means their allegiances are fluid and are thus allied with various foreign and domestic actors when their goals align. The government's approach to the Mai Mai has likewise been inconsistent. During periods of heightened conflict, such as the current crisis with M23, Kinshasa has often tacitly supported or even armed Mai Mai groups as proxies against other threats. In May 2023, the Congolese parliament passed legislation formally establishing a reserve corps, essentially legitimizing pro-government militias, many of which were Mai Mai groups. But the strategy of using Mai Mai as proxies has consistently backfired. Once armed and empowered, these groups rarely disband when the immediate threat passes. Instead, they become entrenched in local power structures, continuing to extort local populations and resisting state authority. It's like giving a child a flamethrower and then expecting them not to burn the house down. We chose to highlight these groups because although they differ significantly, they share one crucial similarity: they thrive in the absence of effective state authority. This absence was at its peak immediately after the end of the Second Congo War, and there were those looking to exploit it. All of which brings us to the formation of the most notorious group of all, the group that right now is causing chaos in Congo's east, the group known as M23. Do you remember RCD, the Rwandan-backed paramilitary that fought Kinshasa during the Second Congo War? Well, they were resistant to the transition to civilian democratic rule because, according to Jason Stearns, an associate professor at Simon Fraser University, they had the most to lose. Writing for the Rift Valley Institute's Usalama project, Jason documents this feeling, highlighting RCD leadership's concern that it would be decimated in the post-war election. It turns out they're absolutely right. In Congo's historic 2006 elections, the first multi-party vote in over 40 years, RCD's presidential candidate got a pitiful 1.69%. Their parliamentary presence collapsed from 94 seats to a mere 15. RCD's loss felt like an existential crisis to DRC's Tutsi community, and ethnic tensions were at an all-time high. Enter Laurent Nkunda, a charismatic, albeit brutal, former RCD commander. His forces were implicated in the May 2002 massacre of over 160 civilians. After the elections, Nkunda defected from the newly integrated National Army. Publicly, he cited community security fears. Behind closed doors, fellow officers whispered of Rwanda pulling strings. According to one senior officer quoted in Jason's report, Rwanda told Nkunda and others to refuse. The order came from Kigali. They needed a plan B in case the transition didn't work out. Plan B turned out to be the formation of the CNDP, the National Congress for the Defense of the People. And yes, there are about to be a ton more acronyms thrown your way. We apologize, we don't write the history. But to reiterate, don't worry about remembering them all. The important thing is to simply get a feel for how complex and long-lasting this crisis is. A successor to RCD, CNDP inherited much of the former's structure, personnel, and grievances. They would become so powerful that in 2007, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, the head of the UN's peacekeeping mission in the Congo, would remark, "Mr. Nkunda's forces are the single most serious threat to stability in the DR Congo." Power, however, is transient. In a move that would make Machiavelli proud, on January 4th, 2009, Nkunda was ousted from his leadership role in the CNDP by General Bosco Ntaganda. Ironically, Nkunda had personally recruited Ntaganda as the CNDP's chief of staff. 12 days later, Ntaganda appeared at a public ceremony at the Elusive Hotel in Goma, flanked by the Rwandan defense minister and the Congolese interior minister, and announced that he would be joining the Congolese army. A week later, in a final betrayal, Rwandan forces arrested Nkunda. Now, a lot of factors played a part in Nkunda's fall, but according to Henry Boshoff, an analyst at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa, Rwanda felt he was getting too big for his britches. We've mentioned that Nkunda was a charismatic figure, but that doesn't really do him justice. A media darling, he was getting a lot of attention, especially after a widely publicized moment dancing with UN envoy Olusegun Obasanjo. Additionally, Nkunda's statements that he would protect the whole of the DRC indicated to Rwanda that his ambition had grown beyond an allowable level. Even without Nkunda, though, the drama carried on. On March the 23rd, the Congolese government formalized an integration deal with the CNDP, unwittingly setting the stage for the formation of one of the most violent rebel groups in the country's history, M23. The problem was that integration was poisoned from the start. Ntaganda manipulated the process, securing mineral-rich postings for loyalists who swiftly monopolized Eastern DRC's trafficking networks, creating a power base from which the government would struggle to dislodge them. Meanwhile, Nkunda supporters rallied around Colonel Sultani Makenga in South Kivu. Kinshasa, alarmed by Ntaganda's vice-like grip on power, viewed this schism as an opportunity to break the group. To that end, the government tried to deploy ex-CNDP commanders outside their strongholds, but this was met with staunch resistance. The government even went as far as seeking help from Kigali, promising economic opportunities in return for help dealing with the ex-CNDP men. What Kinshasa didn't know was that Kigali was secretly aiding the former CNDP fighters, getting them ready for a mutiny. In 2012, CDNP fighters launched 2 revolts, which the government quickly quashed. President Joseph Kabila subsequently announced that the mutineers would face military justice instead of reintegration. Additionally, ex-CNDP officers would be redeployed away from their power bases. This hardline stance forced Rwanda to shift from tacit to overt support of the nascent rebellion to prevent it from being stamped out entirely. On May the 4th, the Congolese army forced the mutineers, including Ntaganda, to move out of Masisi to a narrow stretch of hills close to the Rwandan border. In response, Sultani Makenga and his officers defected, crossing into Rwanda to meet Rwandan officers before joining the other mutineers. 2 days later, they unveiled M23, named after the March agreement they accused the government of violating. And so, we return to one of this episode's great themes: Rwandan-backed rebel groups rampaging across the DRC and capturing territory. M23 unleashed its first offensive in June, and by July the 6th it captured Bunagana, a town on the border with Uganda. Next, it took Rutshuru, a town 70 kilometers away from North Kivu's provincial capital, Goma, its primary target. Fighting continued throughout the year, with M23 making incremental gains on Goma before eventually capturing the city on November the 20th. The government launched a counteroffensive to retake it, but the force disintegrated so rapidly that their troops were forced to flee to Minova, a town more than 50 kilometers away. Demoralized, angry, and panicking, the soldiers launched a systematic campaign of violence against civilians, including a 3-day-long campaign of sexual assault against the town's women. M23's control of Goma, however, was short-lived. Under international pressure, they withdrew on December 1, 2012, enabling dual peace processes, one between Congo and M23, and the other between Congo and 10 African nations, including Rwanda and Uganda. The latter was meant to address both the M23 rebellion and the root causes of the conflict that had rocked the DRC since the 90s. It produced the Addis Ababa Agreement signed in February 2013. Kinshasa pledged security sector reforms, while neighboring countries vowed to stop supporting rebel groups. Additionally, the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, would send a military force to support the Congolese government. This force would eventually integrate with MONUSCO, the UN's peacekeeping mission in the DRC, fighting as the FIB, or the United Nations Force Intervention Brigade. While the government was bolstering its international support, things were looking bleak for M23. The group had inherited the intense factionalism and power struggles that bedeviled its predecessors, and a disagreement over how to respond to the Addis Ababa Agreement would expose these divisions for all to see. Two centers of power had emerged within the group. Military power rested in Sultani Makenga's hands, while political power was vested in Jean-Marie Reniga Lagero, an ally of Ntaganda. Sultani ousted Jean-Marie from M23, accusing him of treason because of financial embezzlement, divisions, ethnic hatred, deceit, and political immaturity. Quite the irony there coming from a rebel leader. Troops loyal to the two clashed for weeks before Jean-Marie finally accepted defeat and internment in Rwanda. 3 days after Reninga's surrender, Ntaganda emerged from hiding and turned himself into the US Embassy in Kigali, requesting a transfer to the ICC. Abandoned by Rwanda, hammered by the Congolese army and the FIB, and crippled by factionalism, M23 conceded defeat in November 2013. A month later, M23 and the Congolese government signed a peace deal in Nairobi, ending the first phase of the M23 crisis. A large number of M23's troops self-demobilized and returned to their homes, while the rest split into factions, one led by Makenga in Uganda and the other led by Jean-Marie Reniga in Rwanda. In a perfect world, DRC's dalliance with violence would end here, their foe vanquished, the leaders in exile, and a peace deal guaranteeing her neighbors wouldn't interfere in internal affairs. However, life in the Congo is rarely that simple. On November 13th, 2016, Reuters reported that Makenga had vanished from a camp for demobilized fighters in Uganda, and gunfire had erupted outside an important border town. The Congolese army increased its patrols, but it was too late. Sultani Makenga and about 100 battle-hardened loyalists had slipped back into DRC's mist-shrouded mountains, ready to write the next bloody chapter in Congo's seemingly endless tragedy. A tragedy that would take us right back up to the events of today. The country that Sultani returned to was teetering on the edge of a constitutional crisis. Joseph Kabila, in power since his father's assassination in 2001, was coming to the end of his second term in office. In a normal democracy, that would mean, at the very least, plans for an election should be in place. When the Independent National Electoral Commission, or CENI, failed to announce such plans, the Congolese people decided to make sure the government understood their feelings. Protests erupted. Opposition leaders accused Kabila, constitutionally barred from seeking a third term, of attempting a power grab. Blood stained the streets before a fragile agreement allowed Kabila to stay in office until 2017, when elections would be held. Enter Corneille Nangaa, president of CENI. In July 2017, Nangaa announced what many had feared, that elections wouldn't be happening that year either. Opposition leader Felix Tshisekedi took to Twitter accusing him of, quote, declaring war on the Congolese people. This accusation would prove prophetic. When the elections were eventually held in 2018, Felix Tshisekedi emerged victorious, but the seeds of enmity between him and Nanga had already been sown. In 2023, 5 years later, Nanga formed a political party, Action for the Dignity of Congo and Its People, or ADCP, unveiling his presidential ambitions. He also picked a fight with President Tshisekedi, claiming that he had actually lost the 2018 elections and was only in power because of a backroom deal with former President Kabila. Tshisekedi denied the allegations, but we have to stress that such claims can be ruinous even in the most functional democracies. I mean, just look at the chaos Stop the Steal unleashed in America. In Congo, with the country at war against M23, if enough people believed Nanga, this story would have taken a much, much darker turn. Now, before we go on, we have to make a point about Nanga. Before 2023, he wasn't a soldier or a politician. In fact, before his 2015 appointment to the Electoral Commission, he worked as an economist who had worked with organizations such as the World Bank. He wasn't the kind of person you'd envision leading a rebellion, let alone one as devastating as M23. So you can imagine the surprise among Congo observers when, on December the 15th, 2023, Nanga announced the formation of the Congo River Alliance with M23 as its armed wing. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. The version of M23 that joined Nanga's Congo River Alliance was much different from the version that snuck into the country in 2016. The 2016 version of M23 was a pale shadow of past glories. Fragmented and abandoned, they were a spent force unable to take advantage of the turmoil around them. After Tshisekedi's victory in 2018, his government brokered a deal with Kigali. M23 fighters would be granted amnesty, with some being integrated into the Congolese army and the National Park Service. However, with M23 in a weakened state, there was no urgency from Tshisekedi's government to implement the agreement. They had bigger fish to fry, specifically our old friends, the Islamic State-aligned ADF. M23 waited for talks to continue, but patience wears thin. By 2020, they were sending envoys to Kinshasa only to be met with months of bureaucratic silence. They lashed out, attacking the Congolese army, killing 4 soldiers. Even then, it would take more than M23's frustration to reignite the flame. The final spark? Regional tensions. Now, we previously talked about how Operation Shuja inflamed tensions between Rwanda and Uganda. What we didn't mention is that the operation was part of a broader attempt by Tshisekedi's government to bolster ties with Uganda. Uganda and the DRC had signed a deal to allow Ugandan companies to construct 2 roads in DRC, Kasindi Beni Butembo and Bunagana Goma. The Bunagana Goma road was to run just a few kilometers from the Rwandan border. The 2 governments also signed an MOU providing military protection to road crew workers. Uganda wasn't the only country with a sanctioned presence in the DRC. Burundi had received Kinshasa's blessing to deploy troops in South Kivu to hunt down members of Red Tabara, a rebel militia that had previously received Rwandan support. It became apparent to Rwandan officials that they too would need a presence in the DRC. The 2 nations signed an MOU to combat jihadists, terrorism, drug trafficking, and smuggling. Under the terms of the MOU, the Rwandan and Congolese police would set up a joint operational unit in Goma to fight terrorism. You could probably guess how the Congolese public reacted to Rwandan police crossing into their territory. If you used any of the 3 words, swift, loud, or deadly there, well, congratulations. A protest against the Rwandan presence in Goma left 4 dead, 3 demonstrators and 1 police officer. After the demonstrations, the Congolese police held a press conference denying that Rwandan police would be operating in Congo, ignoring the previously signed MOU. These dynamics left Rwanda feeling vulnerable, isolated, and according to the Congo Research Group, under siege. If Rwanda couldn't have a sanctioned presence in the DRC, she'd have an unsanctioned one. It was time to awaken the ghosts of M23. And it's here that we get to the sparks that caused the current inferno. March the 28th, 2022. The first shots ring out. M23 storm Shanju and Runyoni, 2 villages in North Kivu that have been important strongholds during their first campaign. To underscore the importance of this mission, Sultani Makenga appears in person to lead it. Next, they turn their attention to Bunagana, the same town they had taken in 2013, now a crucial link in Uganda's road-building project. According to International Crisis Group researcher Onesphore Sematumba, Rwanda's reactivation of M23 was partly because of a desire to stop this infrastructure project in its tracks. Later, UN investigators would estimate that their fighting force was 400 strong, nothing to sneeze is at but a pittance compared to the numbers M23 could field in the past. It took them 3 months, but the group eventually captured Bunagana, spurring then Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta to call for the formation of a new peacekeeping force. A flurry of diplomatic efforts followed. Leaders from Kenya, Burundi, Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC all gathered in Nairobi pushing for peace. They devised a two-pronged approach: a carrot and a stick. The carrot, negotiations between M23 and the Congolese government. The stick, a regional military offensive to force M23 to stand down. We don't know for sure if this strategy would have worked. What we do know is that the Congolese government felt that sitting across the table from M23, the only armed group at these negotiations, would give the group too much legitimacy. They renamed the talks consultations and invited 40 other armed groups, including several Mai-Mai, in an attempt to diminish M23's importance. But that's the trouble with diminishing a group's importance. I tend to notice that they've been demoted from VIP to meat in the room. And the sort of men who go out and formed armed group to conquer cities don't tend to be the sorts of men who will lightly brush off insults. M23 broke off the talks. Initially, President Tshisekedi was all like, "Wait, perfect, this is an excuse me to ramp up the pressure." Kicking out his original negotiators, who he thought were too soft on M23, he appointed Sergei Shishabangu, an advisor who advocated for a more hardline stance. Shishabangu spearheaded the government's outreach to other armed groups, culminating in agreements with several groups to cease hostilities against the government and ally against M23. In public, Tshisekedi disavowed the agreement, saying, "You can't put out a fire by throwing oil on it." In private, however, the Congolese top brass acknowledged the wisdom of the deal. Congo's forces were stretched thin fighting the ADF and M23 and couldn't afford to focus on other insurgencies. The only problem? By creating such a wide front against the snubbed M23, the government had pushed them into a corner. And what does a desperate animal do when it's cornered? Well, it grabs the biggest gun it can find and it unleashes hell. After the snub in Nairobi, M23 hit back hard. But they weren't alone. A UN security report revealed that Rwanda sent in reinforcements for key operations, especially those targeting strategic towns. Their biggest play? The attack on the Rumangabo military base, M23's most aggressive move since hostilities resumed. The attack on Rumangabo was nothing short of apocalyptic. The skies over it darkened with a relentless barrage of mortar fire and the staccato roar of automatic weapons. The air turned acrid with the smell of burning propellants, and every explosion sent tremors through the ground. M23 fighters, emerging like wraiths, descended upon the base with a ferocity born of years of pent-up anger. Local eyewitnesses recalled that for over an hour, the base was engulfed in a relentless exchange of gunfire and explosions, a nightmarish ballet of destruction that would end far too many lives. When the guns went quiet, M23 had captured the base, but the Congolese army would retake it days later. Congo's foreign minister, Christophe Lutungula, directly blamed Rwanda for the attack, saying, "Rwanda, I say it without hesitation, attacked the Rumangabo camp, an important military base of the Congolese armed forces." Similar scenes would play out across much of eastern DRC in the ensuing months. By October 2022, M23 had blitzed through Rutshuru territory, capturing key towns and severing National Road 2, Goma's vital link to the north. The city, once bustling, now relied on trade with Rwanda for survival. With Rutshuru firmly in their control, M23 advanced along three fronts: northwards to Ishida, a town along the border with Uganda, southwards towards Goma, stopping roughly 90 kilometers from the city, and westward toward the Bwito chiefdom. M23 was much stronger than it had ever been, and according to the Congo Research Group, this was because of renewed support from Uganda and Rwanda. The CRG report alleges that Kampala's support was more passive, allowing M23 to cross into Ugandan territory to treat their wounded and recruit new members. Rwanda was more implicit in its support, as we saw in the UN report, providing training, equipment, and manpower to M23. Kinshasa reacted to M23's startling strength by bringing in 2 Su-25 fighter jets operated under a partnership with the mercenary company Agamera to bomb M23 strongholds. This bombing campaign inflated tensions with Rwanda, which accused the DRC of violating her airspace. As M23 gazed at the sky, wondering when the next attack would come, they failed to spot 2 ambushes by the Mai-Mai, first on November the 14th and then on the 17th. These attacks, while successful, provoked a disproportionate response from M23. Angry and seeking retaliation, they descended upon Kishishi, a village in Rutshuru territory, with ruthless precision. Nowhere was safe, not even the local Adventist church. According to an eyewitness, M23 stormed the church with one soldier saying, "All the men are in the church. You pretend to be displaced persons, but you are the rebels who shot at us." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unchallengeable. The men were forcibly separated from their loved ones, their pleas for mercy ignored by men for whom death is just a part of the job. They were marched to the outskirts of the village and ordered to sit with their feet in hastily dug trenches. They formed a grim circle around the impending mass grave. The rebels, methodical in their cruelty, began the executions. Gunshots rang out, bodies slumped into the earth, and the trenches filled. Once the men were killed, they turned to the women and children, unleashing unspeakable acts of sexual violence. Daylight revealed the true scale of the massacre. According to Julien Kahongya, DRC's Minister of Industry, more than 300 people died, and the world took notice, and condemnation was swift. Denis Mukwege, 2018 Nobel Peace Prize winner for his work with victims of sexual violence, called for international mobilization against Rwanda's aggression in the DRC. Antony Blinken, the then US Secretary of State, urged Kigali to stop supporting M23. But as we've seen in so many other conflicts in recent years, words do nothing. Without the international community willing to back up their threats, M23 were free to keep doing whatever the hell they liked. And what they wanted to do was capture Kichanga, something they achieved in January 2023. This was both a symbolic victory because it was where Laurent Nkunda, their ideological forebear, had once ruled. But it was also a strategic one. Sat between Masisi and Butshuru, Kichanga provided a great base from which M23 could further expand their operations. As M23 was eyeing up Masisi, regional military commanders gathered in Nairobi to reorganize their peacekeeping forces. The East African Community Regional Force, or EACRF, began deploying in March and essentially froze the conflict as the front line moved very little between April and October. Despite this, according to Kenya's then Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Alfred Mutua, the EACRF did not seek to, quote, fight M23 or anyone else. In his view, the EACRF's mandate was to provide security so that belligerents could negotiate. Kinshasa disagreed. This fundamental misalignment was the main reason why, at the end of 2023, DRC refused to renew the EACRF's mandate. Angry at the EACRF's approach, Tshisekedi's government began seeking alternative allies. He brought in international mercenary companies, including the previously mentioned Agamera, to train his fighters. Regionally, he turned to the Southern African Development Community, which on May the 8th agreed to deploy a military force to the DRC. The force was deployed on December the 15th, 2023, fighting as SAMA DRC, the SADC mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This date is symbolic because it's the same date that Nanga announced the formation of the Congo River Alliance. On February 24th, 2024, M23, now fighting under the banner of the Congo River Alliance, captured the town of Shasha. A day later, 4 other towns had fallen and M23 controlled all the routes out of Goma. By the 7th, M23 was on its way to Sake, home to the UN Force Intervention Brigade since July 2013. The tensions got worse in July after Kagame did an interview with France 24 where he declared Rwanda was ready to go to war with DRC if necessary. A UN report highlighting that Rwandan fighters in the DRC outnumbered M23's fighters only worsened the situation. The report also highlighted a worrying trend. Military officers were exploiting vulnerable children, some barely 12 years old, promising them jobs and money only to be funneled into training camps supervised by M23 fighters and Rwandan soldiers. By the start of 2025, things were looking bleak in eastern DRC. On January 4th, M23 captured Masisi before moving on to Rabar, a key site in the extraction of coltan. By the 19th, they had captured the mineral-rich towns of Changu and Lumbishi, and on the night of the 20th, they captured Minova, the first major town in South Kivu to fall. From there, they moved to Kasunyu, effectively cutting Goma off from a critical supply route. Goma fell days later. And so, our story comes full circle. Those apocalyptic scenes that we opened with, the women cowering for their life against the motorcycle, the grim-faced soldiers marching toward a front line that meant certain death, this is when they took place. At the epicenter of a crisis that seemed to come out of nowhere, but which, as we now know, was decades in the making. In the months since the fall of Goma, M23 has continued to capture more towns, leaving more death and more destruction in their wake. And their goal is simple. And I'll let Nanga explain it in his own words. Our objective is neither Goma nor Bukavu, but Kinshasa, the source of all the problems. In Congo, we have a weak state, or a non-state. Where all the armed groups have sprung up, it's because there's no state. We want to recreate the state. For Nanga and the Congo River Alliance, this current conflict has only one outcome: the deposition of Tshisekedi and the reinvention of the Congolese state. It's a goal achieved only once by Laurent Kabila at the end of the First Congo War, and the government in Kinshasa is desperate to avoid the same fate. An ideal world for Kinshasa would see M23 and the Congo River Alliance defeated and Rwanda unable to interfere in DRC's internal affairs ever again. But we don't live in an ideal world, do we? History suggests that a military solution is unlikely to succeed fully. As we previously mentioned, the terrain of eastern DRC, with its dense forests and mountainous landscapes, favors guerrilla warfare. Government forces have consistently struggled to defeat determined rebel groups in this environment. We live in a world of compromise, diplomacy, and negotiation, where if diplomacy doesn't work the first time, we try and try again until it finally does. When the conflict broke out, Nairobi led the peace process, bringing everyone to the table to try and find a solution. When these talks broke down, Angola took up the baton. In 2024, observers expected Tshisekedi and Kagame to meet on the sidelines of an African Union summit in Addis Ababa. When this didn't happen, Angola organized separate meetings with each leader to try and find common ground. In March, Luanda played host to a ministerial meeting aimed at paving the way for a peace summit. To lighten the load on Angola's shoulders, the global community intensified their pressure campaign against Rwanda. The US imposed sanctions on key players in Rwanda and M23. The UK paused critical economic support to Rwanda. Germany froze aid. Belgium rebuked Kigali, and the EU called for stronger penalties, among them a ban on importing minerals from Rwanda. The pressure campaign had mixed results. Initially, both Rwanda and DRC indicated a willingness to come to the table and negotiate. Angola planned a December 15th tripartite summit that would address Congo's plan to neutralize the FDLR, hopefully the first in a series of steps to find a lasting peace. Unfortunately, on December the 14th, a day before the talks were to be held, they were unexpectedly cancelled after Rwanda conditioned its involvement on Kinshasa engaging in direct negotiations with M23. This was untenable for the Congolese government, who once again felt it would give M23 too much legitimacy. According to Jason Stearns, this was a calculated move on Rwanda's part. In an interview with Reuters, Jason claimed that Rwanda and M23 needed to be seen as engaging in the present peace talks, but were actually seeking to expand their control in eastern Congo to gain leverage in future negotiations. The situation in Luanda points to a fundamental flaw underlying all these failed peace attempts. The key actors often lack genuine commitment to a lasting peace. For the armed groups, continued conflict can be extremely profitable through control of valuable mining areas and trade routes. For Rwanda, a weak and fractured DRC serves her strategic interests, and for the Congolese government, focusing on external threats can distract from internal governance failures. Moreover, peace agreements often focus on short-term cessation of hostilities rather than addressing the long-term structural issues that fuel conflict. This geopolitical reality is further complicated by the mineral wealth at stake. The $24 trillion worth of minerals beneath Congolese soil has made peace elusive, as control of these resources represents not just regional power, but global economic leverage in an increasingly resource-competitive world. It's why political analyst Dr. John Acko is skeptical over the potential for lasting peace. After the failure of the December talks, Angola withdrew as a key mediator to make way for an expanded international mediation team. However, even this has had only marginal success. A meeting brokered by Qatar between Tshisekedi and Kagame yielded a joint statement calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, and not very much else. The violence continued unabated, and M23 continued their steady march through eastern Congo. The recent appointment of 5 former African heads of state, including Nigeria's Obasanjo and South Africa's Motlanthe, to facilitate peace, represents yet another attempt to regionalize the solution. But this approach faces the same fundamental challenge: the interests of external powers who benefit from continued instability. The EU sanctions and Qatar's economic leverage over Rwanda demonstrate how this African problem has become thoroughly internationalized, with global powers using economic tools to shape regional outcomes. On April 9th, the Congolese government was set to meet M23 in Qatar, but this was called off with no future date in place. That it didn't take place proves our point: no one is committed to a lasting peace process. So where's that leave us? Well, for you and me, Not much is going to change. We will continue living our lives normally, occasionally hearing about the Congo when the media deigns to cover it. Maybe it'll even crop up on this channel's weekly Situation Room series, a small reminder for our viewership that bad things are still happening all those thousands of kilometers away. However, for the millions of Congolese civilians caught in this never-ending cycle of violence, anything other than a lasting peace is catastrophic. Another failed peace process doesn't just mean continued political instability. It means more displaced families, more children recruited into armed groups, more women subjected to sexual violence, and more communities destroyed. In 2008, the International Rescue Committee estimated that more than 5.4 million people had died since the start of the Congo conflict in 1998. Today, that number's dramatically higher. Couple that with over 7 million displaced people, and you begin to truly understand just how devastating this conflict has been. When talking about wars, it's easy to just focus on the men with the guns because they're the loudest, the scariest, and they command the most attention. Win or lose, they're guaranteed a place in the history books. Civilians, on the other hand, often fall by the wayside. And that's why we chose to close this out by quoting one of the victims of this crisis, Adele Shimiyi, who spoke with the Associated Press as she fled from a refugee camp to Goma. "We are going to Goma, but I heard that there are bombs in Goma too, so now we don't know where to go." Right now, there are millions of people out there like Adele, and unless everyone gets to the table to find a lasting solution, they will continue to suffer with nowhere to go. Helpless pawns in a bloody chess match being played by people who don't even know they exist. Thank you for watching.